Dr. Edmund Hartwell had always prided himself on being a man of methodical habits and rational disposition. As Senior Fellow of Antiquities at Magdalene College, Cambridge, he had spent the better part of his 47 years immersed in dusty manuscripts and crumbling stonework, finding in the ordered study of the past a refuge from the uncertainties of modern life. It was this very dedication to scholarly precision that had led him, in the autumn of 1923, to accept the curious commission from the estate of the late Colonel Reginald Blackwood. The Colonel, it seemed, had been something of an amateur historian himself, and his recent death had left his executors with a substantial collection of medieval documents and artifacts that required proper cataloging. The task was not unusual. Hartwell had performed similar services for numerous country estates, but there was something in the solicitor's letter that had piqued his interest. The collection, Mr. Pembroke had written in his careful script, contained items of particular antiquarian significance, including certain manuscripts relating to the former Abbey of St. Dunstan. Dissolved in 1539, the abbey had been one of the smaller religious houses, its history largely forgotten, and Hartwell felt the familiar thrill of discovery that came with the prospect of illuminating some forgotten corner of England's past. Greystone Manor stood on the borders of Norfolk and Suffolk, a rambling Tudor edifice of mellow brick and leaded windows that had been the Blackwood family seat for nearly 4 centuries. As Hartwell's motorcar crunched up the gravel drive on that gray October morning, he noted with approval the way the building seemed to have grown from the landscape itself, its chimneys and gables rising naturally from the gentle hills that surrounded it. The grounds were well maintained, but possessed that quality of settled age that spoke of generations of careful stewardship. Mrs. Blackwood, the Colonel's widow, received him in the morning room with the restrained courtesy of her class. She was a woman of perhaps 60, dressed in the deep mourning that fashion still demanded, her silver hair arranged with military precision. "Dr. Hartwell," she said, extending a gloved hand, "how good of you to come." Reginald would have been so pleased. He had the greatest admiration for Cambridge scholarship. Over tea and seed cake, she outlined the circumstances of his visit. The Colonel, she explained, had inherited the collection from a great-uncle, who had purchased it from the estate of a local antiquary in the 1870s. Reginald was always meaning to have it properly examined, she said, stirring her tea with mechanical precision, but somehow the years slipped by. Since his passing, I find I haven't the heart for such things, and frankly, the documents rather disturb me. This last comment she delivered with a slight shiver, as if the mere thought of the collection produced some physical discomfort. When Hartwell inquired as to the nature of her unease, she became vague, speaking only of unpleasant associations and things better left undisturbed. Such superstitions were not uncommon among the landed gentry, Hartwell reflected, particularly when dealing with material from the dissolved monasteries. The violent suppression of the religious houses had left deep scars in the English countryside, and local folklore often invested their ruins with an atmosphere of menace. The library at Greystone Manor occupied the entire east wing of the house, a splendid room paneled in dark oak with tall windows that looked out over the parkland. It was here that the Colonel had housed his collection, arranging the documents in a series of glass-fronted cabinets that lined the walls. Mrs. Blackwood led Hartwell through the room, her footsteps muffled by the thick Persian carpets, and gestured toward a particular cabinet that stood in an alcove near the great fireplace. "The Abbey materials are here," she said, producing a key from her reticule. Reginald kept them separate from the rest. He said, she paused, frowning slightly. He said they seemed to require special care. The cabinet contained perhaps 24 items, bound volumes, loose manuscripts, and several small artifacts wrapped in velvet cloth. As Hartwell examined the collection, he felt the familiar excitement of the scholar confronted with virgin territory. Here were charter rolls and account books, liturgical texts, and correspondence, all the detritus of a religious community that had vanished nearly 4 centuries ago. Most intriguing of all was a slim volume bound in cracked leather, its cover bearing the faded inscription Chronicon Sancti Dunstani in Gothic script. "The Chronicle of St. Dunstan," Hartwell murmured, handling the book with reverent care. Such chronicles were rare survivals from the smaller religious houses. most having been destroyed during the dissolution or lost in the centuries since. This alone would justify the journey. Mrs. Blackwood had withdrawn to a chair by the fireplace, leaving him to his preliminary examination. As he opened the chronicle, a loose sheet of paper fell from between its pages, a fragment of what appeared to be a letter, written in a different hand and on much newer paper. The ink was faded but still legible, and Hartwell found himself reading what seemed to be the final portion of a communication dated March 15, 1847. Cannot recommend too strongly that you abandon this line of inquiry. The events of which you write lie buried for good reason, and there are matters in this world that are best left undisturbed. I have seen what became of poor Ashford after his excavations at the chapter house, and I would not wish such a fate upon any Christian soul. Burn these papers, Blackwood, and speak no more of the white cannon. The letter bore no signature, and the fragment ended there. Hartwell turned the paper over, searching for some indication of its provenance, but found nothing. When he looked up, he discovered that Mrs. Blackwood was watching him with an expression of evident anxiety. "You've found something troubling, haven't you?" she said. "I can always tell Reginald wore just that same expression when he was working with those dreadful things." Hartwell assured her that it was merely a historical curiosity, though privately he found himself intrigued by the reference to the white cannon and the ominous tone of the fragment. Such melodramatic language was not uncommon in Victorian correspondence, of course, but there was something in the letter's urgent cadence that suggested genuine fear, rather than mere antiquarian sensationalism. As the afternoon wore on and the autumn light began to fade from the tall windows, Hartwell found himself drawn deeper into the chronicle's pages. The manuscript was beautifully illuminated, its margins decorated with intricate patterns of leaves and flowers executed in gold and vermilion. The text itself was written in the clear, measured hand of a practiced scribe, recording the daily life of the abbey with methodical precision. Here were accounts of harvests and holy days, of visiting dignitaries and internal disputes, the ordinary concerns of a small religious community in the early 16th century. Yet as Hartwell read on, he began to detect an undercurrent of unease running through the chronicle's measured prose. There were oblique references to difficulties with Brother Benedict, mentions of unseemly practices and nocturnal disturbances that disrupted the community's peace. Most curious of all were the frequent allusions to someone referred to only as Frater Albus, the White Brother or White Canon, whose activities seemed to be a source of considerable anxiety to the chronicler. The light was failing rapidly now, and Mrs. Blackwood had long since retired, leaving Hartwell alone in the great library. He was about to close the chronicle and retire to his room when his eye fell upon a passage near the manuscript's end. Dated just 3 months before the abbey's dissolution, Brother Benedict came to me again this night, weeping and much distressed, begging that I intercede with the abbot regarding Frater Albus. He speaks of terrible things seen in the old crypt, of sounds that have no earthly origin, of a presence that grows stronger with each passing day. I fear the white canon's studies have led him down paths that no Christian soul should tread. God grant that the king's commissioners come soon, for I begin to fear that dissolution may be our only salvation from what dwells beneath." A sudden gust of wind rattled the library windows, causing Hartwell to look up from the manuscript with a start. The room had grown quite dark while he read, and the dancing shadows cast by the fire seemed to press in around the small pool of light where he sat. For a moment, he had the uncomfortable sensation that he was not alone, that somewhere in the darkness, beyond the firelight, someone or something was watching with patient malevolence. The feeling passed as quickly as it had come, leaving him somewhat embarrassed by his momentary fancy. He was clearly more tired than he had realized, and the day's journey, combined with the abbey material's medieval atmosphere, had evidently affected his imagination. Still, as he carefully closed the chronicle and prepared to retire for the night, he found himself glancing more than once toward the shadowed corners of the room, and when he finally made his way upstairs, he was conscious of an odd reluctance to look back at the library door. The next morning dawned gray and cheerless, with a persistent drizzle that seemed to drain all color from the Norfolk landscape. Hartwell breakfasted alone in the morning room, Mrs. Blackwood having sent her apologies along with word that she had been called away. to attend to some pressing business in the village. The solitude suited him well enough, as it allowed him to return immediately to his examination of the Abbey documents, without the necessity of social conversation. The library seemed different in the pale morning light, less welcoming somehow, despite the cheerful fire that one of the servants had lit in the great hearth. The paneled walls, which had appeared rich and warm the day before, now seemed to press inward with a weight of accumulated years, and the portraits of long-dead Blackwoods gazed down from their frames with expressions that struck Hartwell as vaguely accusatory. He dismissed these impressions as the product of an unsettled night's sleep he had been, troubled by curious dreams involving white-robed figures and echoing stone corridors, and settled himself at the reading table with the remaining documents. Among the materials was a collection of architectural drawings that proved to be of considerable interest. The plans showed the Abbey as it had existed in its final years, a complex of buildings arranged around two courtyards with the church dominating the northern end. What struck Hartwell immediately was the presence of an extensive undercroft beneath the chapter house, marked on the plans as Crypta Antiqua and shaded in a way that suggested considerable depth. Beside this area, in the same medieval hand that had drawn the plans, was a single word in faded ink, clausum sealed. The Morning Post brought a welcome distraction in the form of several letters from Cambridge, including one from his colleague Professor Maitland that contained a curious postscript. "Saw your name in yesterday's Times," Maitland had written, "in connection with some Abbey materials at Greystone Manor. Do be careful. Old fellow, I remember poor Ashford's fate rather too well for comfort. Some things are better left buried." The second reference to the mysterious Ashford piqued Hartwell's curiosity, and he made a mental note to investigate the matter upon his return to Cambridge. By midday, the persistent drizzle had developed into a proper autumn storm, with gusts of wind that sent the remaining leaves spiraling past the library windows, and rain that drummed against the glass with increasing intensity. The electric lighting had been installed at Greystone Manor recently, and the storms had affected the supply, leaving Hartwell to work by the uncertain light of oil lamps and the flickering glow from the fireplace. The dancing shadows seemed to animate the room's corners, and more than once he found himself glancing up from his work, certain that he had detected movement in his peripheral vision. It was while examining a collection of loose vellum sheets, what appeared to be notes or drafts for letters, that Hartwell made his most disturbing discovery. The papers were clearly much older than the Victorian fragment he had found the day before, written in the same medieval hand as the Chronicle, but with a quality of urgent haste that suggested extreme agitation. The Latin was crude and hurried, peppered with vernacular phrases, but Hartwell's years of paleographical training allowed him to piece together their meaning. The white cannon grows bold in his blasphemies. The sounds from the crypt now heard even in the Dorter. Brother Benedict speaks of visions, of the dead walking in their cerements. Abbot will not act, says we must not interfere with learned studies. But I have seen the signs, the marks upon the stones. God preserve us, for I fear we have sheltered a devil. The papers were undated, but their position among the other documents suggested they belonged to the Abbey's final months. What struck Hartwell most forcibly was the genuine terror that seemed to emanate from the medieval scribe's words. This was not the stylized horror of monastic allegory, but the authentic voice of fear, raw, immediate, and deeply unsettling. As the afternoon wore on, the storm outside intensified, and with it came an odd acoustic phenomenon that Hartwell initially attributed to the wind's interaction with the manor's ancient architecture. From somewhere deep within the building came a sound like distant chanting, not the ordered Latin of liturgical prayer, but something more primitive and unsettling. The sound seemed to rise and fall with the gusts of wind, and several times Hartwell rose from his chair to investigate, only to find that it faded as soon as he moved away from the reading table. The servants, he noticed, seemed unusually subdued. When the elderly butler, Graves, brought his afternoon tea, the man's hands shook slightly as he set down the tray, and his usual deferential manner was replaced by something approaching fearfulness. When Hartwell commented on the unusual acoustic effects of the storm, Graves's response was both brief and troubling. "The old house has many voices, sir," he said quietly, avoiding Hartwell's eyes. "Particularly when the weather turns. Mrs. Blackwood. She doesn't much care for it when the wind gets up like this. Says it reminds her too much of the Colonel's last days." Before Hartwell could inquire further about this cryptic comment, Graves had withdrawn, leaving him with the uncomfortable impression that the Manor's staff possessed knowledge they were reluctant to share. This sense of concealed information was reinforced when he encountered the housemaid, a young woman named Sarah, in the corridor outside the library. Upon seeing him, she bobbed a hasty curtsy and would have hurried past, but Hartwell detained her with a question about the evening meal arrangements. "Begging your pardon, sir," she said, her eyes fixed on the carpet, "but might you be the gentleman what's come to look at the old Abbey papers?" When Hartwell confirmed this, the girl's expression grew troubled. "My grandmother, she lived in the village all her life, sir, and she always said as how them old papers should have been burned when the Abbey fell. Said there was things in that place what shouldn't have been disturbed." "What sort of things?" Hartwell asked gently, but the girl only shook her head and muttered something about the White Canon's curse, before hurrying away down the corridor. These fragmentary hints of local folklore might ordinarily have amused Hartwell, but coming as they did after his morning's discoveries, they served only to deepen his sense of unease. The Abbey had clearly left a profound impression on the collective memory of the region, one that persisted even after nearly 4 centuries. Such longevity of folk tradition usually indicated that the events commemorated had been of unusual significance or unusual horror. As evening approached and the storm continued unabated, Hartwell found himself increasingly conscious of the library's oppressive atmosphere. The room seemed to have developed a quality of watchful stillness that was distinctly unnerving, as if the very walls were listening to his thoughts. The portraits of the Blackwood ancestors appeared to have shifted in their frames, their painted eyes following his movements with cold calculation. Even the books themselves seemed different, their leather bindings darker, their gilt titles more difficult to read, as if some subtle transformation were taking place in the gathering dusk. The sensation reached its peak as Hartwell prepared to light the additional oil lamps that would be needed for evening work. As he reached for the matches, his hand froze in midair, arrested by a sound that seemed to come from directly beneath his feet. It was a rhythmic tapping, as of someone knocking on wood with deliberate persistence. 3 slow raps, followed by a pause. Then 3 more. The sound was muffled but unmistakable, and it seemed to originate from somewhere far below the library floor. Hartwell stood perfectly still, listening intently, but the tapping did not repeat. Instead, there came a different sound, a low, sustained note that might have been singing or might have been the wind in some hidden cavity of the building's structure. Whatever its source, the sound carried with it an indescribable quality of menace that made the hair on the back of his neck stand on end. When Mrs. Blackwood returned that evening, she found Hartwell waiting for her in the drawing room, the Abbey documents temporarily abandoned. Her face, already pale from the day's exertions and the drive through the storm, grew positively ashen when he described the afternoon's discoveries and asked about the history of the manor itself. "The foundations are much older than the Tudor building," she said reluctantly, settling herself in a chair by the fire. "There was a medieval structure here before. Some say it was connected with the Abbey, perhaps a grange or administrative building. When the Blackwoods purchased the land after the dissolution, they built the current manor partly on the old foundations." She paused, staring into the dancing flames, and when she continued, her voice had dropped to barely above a whisper. "Reginald always said there were cellars and passages beneath the house that we'd never fully explored. After his grandfather's time, certain areas were sealed off. Family tradition says there were incidents in the 19th century that made such precautions necessary." "What sort of incidents?" Hartwell inquired, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "The usual country house tales," she replied with forced lightness. "Servants refusing to work in certain areas, guests complaining of disturbances, that sort of thing. Nothing that couldn't be explained by old houses and overactive imaginations." But her manner belied her words, and when a sudden gust of wind shook the windows, she started violently and cast a fearful glance toward the darkened library wing. "Dr. Hartwell," she said suddenly, turning to face him with an expression of barely controlled anxiety, I wonder if I might prevail upon you to conclude your work here as quickly as possible. I find that having those documents disturbed again has unsettled me more than I anticipated." There was something in her tone, a quality of suppressed panic that made Hartwell study her more closely. In the firelight, she looked older than her years, her face drawn with what might have been sleeplessness or constant worry. Her hands, he noticed, trembled slightly as she reached for her teacup, and there were dark circles beneath her eyes that spoke of recent strain. "Of course," he said gently, "I should be able to complete my preliminary cataloging within another day or two at most." Relief flooded her features. "Thank you. I know it seems foolish, but ever since Reginald's death, I've felt watched, particularly when those dreadful papers are being examined. It's as if something in them resents the intrusion, as if summoned by her words." The same distant chanting sound that had puzzled Hartwell earlier began again, rising from somewhere deep within the house. Mrs. Blackwood's teacup rattled against its saucer as her hands began to shake more violently. "There it is again," she whispered. "That horrible sound. It started the night before Reginald died, and it's been growing stronger ever since." The chanting continued for several minutes, a low, rhythmic murmur that seemed to emanate from the very foundations of the building. To Hartwell's trained ear, it sounded remarkably like plainsong, but distorted and somehow inverted, as if the familiar liturgical melodies had been corrupted into something entirely alien. When it finally faded, the silence that followed seemed more oppressive than the sound itself. That night, as Hartwell lay in his bed in the guest chamber, he found sleep elusive despite his exhaustion. The storm had not abated, and the old manor creaked and groaned around him like a ship in heavy seas. But it was not the weather that kept him wakeful, it was the growing certainty that his presence at Greystone Manor had somehow awakened forces that had long lain dormant. Somewhere in the small hours, he was roused from a fitful doze by the sound of footsteps in the corridor outside his room. The footsteps were slow and measured, as if their owner moved with great deliberation, and they seemed to pause directly outside his door before continuing toward the library wing. Hartwell lay still, listening intently, but heard no return journey, and when he finally summoned the courage to investigate, he found the corridor empty and dark. But as he stood there in his night clothes, peering through the gloom toward the library, he could have sworn he detected a faint glow emanating from beneath the door, not the warm yellow of lamplight, but something colder and more spectral, like moonlight on snow. The following morning brought no improvement in the weather, and Hartwell woke to find the manor shrouded in a thick fog that seemed to muffle all sound and reduce the world beyond the windows to a gray void. The atmosphere inside the house felt correspondingly oppressive, as if the mist had somehow penetrated the very walls and filled the rooms with its clammy presence. Mrs. Blackwood appeared at breakfast looking haggard and distressed, her usually immaculate appearance disheveled in a way that suggested a sleepless night. When Hartwell inquired after her health, she merely shook her head and muttered something about the sounds growing worse. Before excusing herself and withdrawing to her private sitting room, left to his own devices, Hartwell returned to the library with a mixture of scholarly determination and growing unease. The room felt different again this morning, colder despite the fire that burned in the grate, and filled with an almost tangible sense of expectancy, as if something momentous were about to occur. The Abbey documents lay exactly as he had left them the previous evening, but there was something subtly wrong about their arrangement that he could not quite identify. It was while examining a collection of financial records, dry accounts of grain purchases and livestock sales, that Hartwell experienced his first genuine supernatural encounter. He had been working for perhaps an hour when he became aware of a presence behind him, a sense of someone standing just at the edge of his vision. When he turned to look, however, he found nothing but empty air and the familiar shadows cast by the morning light. Filtering through the fog-wrapped windows, the sensation persisted, growing stronger rather than fading, until Hartwell found it impossible to concentrate on his work. Each time he bent over the documents, he felt eyes upon him, watching with an intensity that made his skin crawl. The feeling was so powerful that he eventually abandoned his attempts at scholarly detachment and spoke aloud to the apparently empty room. "Who's there?" he called, his voice sounding thin and uncertain in the library's depths. Show yourself." The silence that followed was profound and somehow expectant, as if his challenge were being considered by an intelligence vast and alien. Then, just as he was beginning to feel foolish for addressing empty air, came a response that made his blood run cold. It was a whisper, barely audible but unmistakably present, a single word spoken in a voice that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "Frater." Hartwell spun around, his heart hammering against his ribs, but the library remained empty. Yet the whisper seemed to hang in the air like an echo that refused to fade, and with it came a scent that had not been present moments before, the cold, musty odor of ancient stone and centuries of decay. For several minutes, he stood frozen, every sense alert for further manifestations, but nothing more occurred. Gradually, his rational mind began to reassert itself, offering mundane explanations for what he had experienced. The whisper could have been the wind in the chimney, the scent merely the mustiness of old documents combined with his overwrought imagination. Yet even as he attempted to dismiss the incident, he found himself glancing repeatedly over his shoulder, unable to shake the conviction that he was no longer alone in the room. It was then that he noticed the change in the documents themselves. The loose vellum sheets, the agitated medieval notes he had examined the day before, were no longer where he had left them. Instead of lying flat beneath the glassway he had used to hold them in place, they were scattered across the table as if disturbed by some sudden wind. More disturbing still, they appeared to have been arranged in a deliberate pattern, forming a rough circle round the Chronicle of St. Dunstan. As Hartwell bent to examine this arrangement more closely, he noticed something that made his hands tremble as he reached for the papers. Where before the medieval scribblings had been chaotic and disorganized, they now seemed to form a coherent narrative when read in sequence. The terror of the unknown monk was even more palpable now, his desperate warnings about Frater Albus taking on an urgency that transcended the centuries. "He comes to me in dreams now. The white canon, his face a void beneath the cowl, speaking words that freeze the soul. The crypt door stands open though we barred it with iron and stone. God help us, for the dead refuse their rest while he walks among us." The papers trembled in Hartwell's grasp, though whether from his own nervousness or some other cause, he could not say. As he read, the library seemed to grow progressively colder, and the fog outside pressed against the windows with an almost malevolent persistence. When he reached the final fragment, a prayer for deliverance written in an increasingly shaky hand, he found his own voice joining the medieval monk's desperate plea, though he was not consciously aware of speaking aloud. It was at this moment that the first truly unmistakable supernatural manifestation occurred. As the words of the Latin prayer left his lips, the temperature in the room plummeted with shocking suddenness, and his breath began to mist in the suddenly frigid air. The fire in the grate, which had been burning steadily all morning, flickered and dimmed as if deprived of oxygen. Most terrifying of all, the documents on the table began to stir and rustle as if touched by an invisible hand. Hartwell stepped back from the table, his scholarly composure finally cracking under the weight of inexplicable phenomena. As he watched in growing horror, the pages of the Chronicle began to turn of their own accord, flipping rapidly through the illuminated text, until they reached the final entry, the passage he had read 2 evenings before, about the White Canon's unholy studies. There the pages stopped, lying open to display the chronicler's final, desperate warnings about what dwells beneath. The silence that followed was absolute and terrible, broken only by the sound of Hartwell's own labored breathing and the frantic beating of his heart. Then, from somewhere far below his feet, came the rhythmic tapping he had heard the previous day, 3 slow raps, followed by a pause, then 3 more. But this time the sound was accompanied by something else, a low, sustained moan that seemed to rise from the very foundations of the building, carrying with it such a weight of anguish and malevolence that Hartwell felt his reason threatening to desert him entirely. The manifestation lasted perhaps 30 seconds, though to Hartwell it seemed like hours. When the sounds finally faded and the normal temperature began to return to the room, he found himself standing against the far wall, though he had no memory of moving there. His clothes were damp with perspiration despite the recent cold, and his hands shook so violently that he could barely light a cigarette. From the silver case in his pocket, it was as he drew the first steadying breath of tobacco that he noticed the final, most disturbing detail of the morning's events. On the table where the chronicle lay open, clearly visible on the vellum page, was a new mark that had not been there before, a single handprint, as if someone had pressed their palm against the ancient manuscript while the ink was still wet. The print was larger than a normal human hand and seemed to have been made by fingers of unusual length and thinness, but most unnervingly of all, the handprint appeared to be still forming, the dark impression spreading slowly across the page like ink through blotting paper, as if whatever had touched the document were still present, still pressing down upon the ancient text with deliberate, malevolent intent. Hartwell fled the library then, abandoning all pretense of scholarly objectivity in the face of phenomena that defied rational explanation. He did not stop until he reached the safety of his room, where he locked the door and sat trembling on the bed, trying to make sense of what he had experienced. But even as he struggled to impose order on the morning's events, he could not escape the growing certainty that his investigations had awakened something that had slumbered for centuries in the depths beneath Greystone Manor, and somewhere far below, barely audible through the old building's thick floors and walls. The tapping continued, 3 slow raps, pause, 3 more, like a patient summons that expected, sooner or later, to be answered. Despite his terror of the previous morning, scholarly curiosity and professional obligation eventually drew Hartwell back to the library. He spent the remainder of that day in his room, attempting to rationalize what he had experienced and to formulate some plan of action. By evening, he had convinced himself that the supernatural manifestations, while undeniably real, must have some explanation rooted in the historical circumstances surrounding the abbey's dissolution. The next morning dawned clear and bright, the oppressive fog having lifted during the night, and with the return of normal weather came a partial restoration of Hartwell's confidence. Mrs. Blackwood appeared at breakfast looking somewhat improved, though she remained pale and distracted. When he informed her of his intention to complete his examination of the documents, she received the news with obvious anxiety, but did not attempt to dissuade him. Perhaps, she said hesitantly, it would be wise to have Graves nearby while you work. He's been with the family for 40 years and knows the house better than anyone. If anything unusual should occur. Hartwell accepted the suggestion gratefully, and it was with the butler's solid presence in the background that he returned to the library. Shortly after 9 o'clock, Graves had positioned himself in a chair near the door, ostensibly occupied with some household accounts, but Hartwell noticed that the old man's eyes rarely strayed from the collection of Abbey documents. The handprint on the chronicle had faded during the night, leaving only a faint stain on the vellum that might have been attributed to age or moisture damage. This discovery provided some comfort to Hartwell's rational mind, though it did nothing to explain how the mark had appeared in the first place. The loose papers had been restored to their proper order, leading him to wonder if some member of the household staff had tiddied the table in his absence. Working with deliberate caution, Hartwell began to piece together a more complete picture of the Abbey's final months. The documents revealed a religious community in crisis, torn between the old ways and the pressures of political change. The abbot, Dom Thomas Cranfield, appeared to have been a weak and indecisive leader, more concerned with preserving his position than with maintaining discipline among his monks. It was in this atmosphere of institutional decay that the figure of Frater Albus had emerged to dominate the Abbey's declining years. The White Canon, for this was clearly his title rather than his name, remained frustratingly elusive in the historical record. He was mentioned frequently in the documents, but never described in detail, as if the chronicler found it difficult or dangerous to commit specific information about him to writing. From scattered references, Hartwell was able to determine that he had arrived at the Abbey sometime in 1537. Claiming to be a learned scholar from the continent with special knowledge of ancient mysteries and forgotten arts, the abbot had apparently welcomed this mysterious figure, perhaps hoping that his scholarship would add luster to the Abbey's reputation and help it survive the gathering storm of dissolution. Permission had been granted for Frater Albus to conduct his studies in the old crypt beneath the chapter house, and a private chamber had been prepared for him in the guest quarters. But almost immediately, his presence had begun to disturb the peace of the community. Brother Benedict, who seemed to have served as something of a secretary or assistant to the White Canon, had been the first to voice concerns about his patron's activities. His complaints, recorded in fragmentary notes and letters, spoke of blasphemous rites performed in the darkness of the crypt, of unhallowed substances brought to the abbey under cover of night, and of sounds that were not of this world echoing through the underground chambers. Most disturbing of all were Benedict's references to physical changes in the White Canon himself. The young monk wrote of his master becoming increasingly gaunt and pale, his eyes taking on a quality of otherworldly luminescence, his speech growing more cryptic and menacing with each passing day. By the winter of 1538, Benedict's notes had become nearly incoherent with terror, filled with desperate prayers and pleas for divine protection from the thing that wears the White Canon's form. As Hartwell delved deeper into these documents, he became aware that Graves had grown increasingly agitated. The old butler had abandoned all pretense of working on his accounts and was watching the proceedings with obvious anxiety. When Hartwell looked up from a particularly disturbing passage describing the walking dead that had allegedly been seen in the abbey cloisters, he found Graves staring at him with an expression of profound unease. "Begging your pardon, sir," the butler said quietly, "but might I suggest you leave those particular papers for another day? There's something about them that doesn't sit well with the house." Before Hartwell could respond to this cryptic warning, his attention was caught by a new document that had somehow worked its way to the top of the pile. It was another of the loose vellum sheets, but this one bore text he had not seen before, text that seemed to have appeared overnight, written in the same anguished hand as the previous fragments. "He speaks to me from the crypt. Though his body lies cold in its niche, death has not silenced the White Canon, but made him bold in his blasphemies. The seal weakens, the barriers fail. Soon you will walk again among the living, and God help us all when that day comes." The handwriting was unmistakably medieval, yet the ink appeared fresh and wet, as if the words had been written only moments before. Hartwell reached out to touch the document, then recoiled as his fingertips encountered not dry vellum, but a surface that was cold and slightly damp, like stone that had been exposed to centuries of underground moisture. "Sir." Graves's voice was sharp with alarm. "Step away from the table, if you please." Hartwell looked up to find the butler standing rigidly at attention, his weathered face pale with fear. Following the old man's gaze, he turned back to the documents and gasped in horror at what he saw. The text on the vellum sheet was changing before his eyes, the letters writhing and reshaping themselves into new words, new warnings. "The seal is broken. The White Canon rises. Beware the one who reads these words, for he has called attention to himself. Death is no barrier to vengeance, and the grave holds no peace for the wicked." As the words formed and reformed on the ancient vellum, the temperature in the library plummeted once again. The fire in the grate dimmed to barely glowing embers, and frost began to form on the window glass despite the bright autumn sunshine outside. Most terrifying of all, a shadow began to coalesce in the corner of the room, not the ordinary shadow cast by furniture or fixtures, but a darkness that seemed to possess substance and malevolent intent. The shadow grew slowly taller and more defined, taking on the rough outline of a human figure draped in flowing robes. Where a face should have been, there was only a void of deeper darkness. Yet Hartwell felt with absolute certainty that something within that emptiness was regarding him with infinite hatred and contempt. "The White Canon," Graves whispered, his voice barely audible above the sound of his own terrified breathing. "God preserve us. He's come back." The shadow figure remained motionless for long moments, its faceless regard fixed upon Hartwell with an intensity that made his skin crawl. Then, with movements that seemed to flow like dark water, it began to glide across the room toward the table where the abbey documents lay scattered. As it moved, the papers themselves began to stir and flutter, as if caught in some unfelt wind. Hartwell found himself paralyzed with terror, unable to move or speak as the apparition drew closer. The cold in the room had become so intense that his breath misted with each exhalation, and ice crystals were forming on his clothing and hair. The shadow reached the table and seemed to pause there, its attention focused on the Chronicle of St. Dunstan. Then, With a sound like wind through empty tombs, it spoke. The voice seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. A whisper that penetrated not just the ears, but the very soul. Who disturbs the rest of Frater Albus? Who dares to read the forbidden words? The question hung in the frigid air like a challenge, and Hartwell felt compelled to respond despite his terror. "I am Edmund Hartwell," he managed to croak through chattering teeth. "I mean no disrespect to the dead." The shadow figure seemed to consider this response, tilting its featureless head with an almost human gesture of contemplation. When it spoke again, there was a note of cruel amusement in its spectral voice. "The dead. You think me dead, little scholar? Death is but another state of being, another realm to be mastered and exploited. I am Frater Albus, the White Canon of St. Dunstan, and I have learned secrets that make a mockery of the grave." As these words echoed through the library, the documents on the table began to levitate, rising slowly into the air and arranging themselves in a complex pattern. Around the floating chronicle, the pages of the book turned of their own accord, flipping through the illuminated text until they reached a section near the end that Hartwell had not previously noticed. "Read," the White Canon commanded, his voice carrying a compulsion that Hartwell found impossible to resist. "Read and understand the true purpose of my studies." With hands that shook violently from cold and fear, Hartwell picked up the chronicle and began to read the newly revealed passage aloud. The text described in clinical detail a series of experiments conducted by the White Canon in the depths of the Abbey crypt, experiments that violated every principle of Christian doctrine and human decency. The White Canon had been attempting, the chronicle revealed, to breach the barrier between life and death, to master the forces that governed the boundary between the living and the dead. Using techniques learned from forbidden texts and unhallowed practices, he had succeeded in extending his own existence beyond the normal span of mortal life, transforming himself into something that was neither fully alive nor properly dead. But his ambitions had extended beyond mere personal immortality. The final entries in the chronicle spoke of a grand design to create an army of undead servants, bound to his will and freed from the constraints of mortal weakness. The Abbey's dissolution had interrupted these plans, but not before the White Canon had completed the rituals necessary to ensure his own survival. Beyond death. As Hartwell read these horrifying revelations aloud, the shadow figure began to solidify, taking on more definite form and substance. The flowing robes became visible as ancient monastic garb, stained with centuries of decay and corruption. The darkness beneath the cowl began to resolve into features of a sort, though they were features that no living man should possess. When Hartwell finally looked up from the chronicle, he found himself face to face with an entity that defied every natural law. The White Canon's visage was a horror of withered flesh and exposed bone, his eye sockets containing not eyes but points of cold, luminous malevolence. His mouth was a lipless gash that revealed teeth like broken stones, and when he smiled, the expression was a rictus of pure evil. "Now you understand," the apparition said, his voice no longer a whisper, but a harsh croak like the sound of tomb doors grinding open. "Now you know why the seal must not be broken, why the old barriers must be maintained. But it is too late, little scholar. Your curiosity has awakened what should have slept forever, and now all shall pay the price of your meddling." The White Canon raised one skeletal hand, and the Abbey documents burst into flames with sudden, unnatural fire. But instead of being consumed, the papers seemed to burn without being destroyed, their surfaces writhing with letters of flame that spelled out words of power in languages that had been forgotten before Christ walked the earth. "The way is open," the White Canon intoned, his voice rising to a howl that seemed to shake the very foundations of the manor. "The dead shall walk again, and the living shall know the true meaning of fear. Begin the great work anew." With these words, the apparition began to fade, but not before fixing Hartwell with a stare of such malevolent promise that he felt his sanity threatening to desert him entirely. As the shadow figure dissolved back into ordinary darkness, the library returned to normal temperature, and the fires in the documents died away, leaving only the faintest scorch marks on the ancient vellum. But the damage had been done. As Hartwell stood trembling in the sudden silence, he knew with absolute certainty that his investigation had disturbed forces. that had slumbered for centuries beneath Greystone Manor. The White Cannon had been awakened, and something told Hartwell that this was only the beginning of the horror to come. Graves, who had remained frozen throughout the entire encounter, finally found his voice. "Sir," he said, his words barely above a whisper, "I think it would be wise if you were to pack your things and leave immediately. Some doors, once opened, can never be closed again." But even as the butler spoke these words, Hartwell knew that escape would not be so simple. The White Cannon had marked him now, had drawn him into the web of ancient malevolence that surrounded the dissolved abbey. Whether he stayed or fled, he suspected that he would not be allowed to simply walk away from what he had unleashed. The investigation had deepened beyond all scholarly parameters, and Hartwell found himself face to face with forces that no amount of academic training had prepared him to encounter. The real horror was only beginning. Despite Graves's urgent recommendation to depart immediately, Hartwell found himself unable to contemplate leaving Greystone Manor. While so many questions remained unanswered, the encounter with the White Cannon, terrifying though it had been, had only intensified his need to understand the forces he had awakened. That evening, after spending the remainder of the day in restless pacing and futile attempts at rational analysis, he made a decision that would prove to be both fateful and irreversible. He would seek out the local history of the abbey and its dissolution, hoping to find some clue that might explain the White Cannon's lingering influence and, more importantly, some means of containing or banishing it. Mrs. Blackwood, when approached with this request, was initially reluctant to assist, but the events of recent days had left her as desperate for answers as Hartwell himself. "There's someone," she said finally, her voice heavy with reluctance. "Mr. Ashworth, the rector of St. Mary's in the village. His family has served this parish for 3 generations, and he's made something of a study of local history. But I must warn you he's rather eccentric, particularly on the subject of the old abbey." The next morning, despite a return of the oppressive gray weather, Hartwell made his way to the village of Lesser Dunstan. The settlement was typical of the region, a cluster of medieval cottages surrounding a Norman church, with a few Georgian additions that spoke of more prosperous times. The Church of St. Mary stood on rising ground at the village's heart, its square tower dominating the surrounding countryside. The Reverend Dr. Marcus Ashworth proved to be a man of perhaps 70, with the stooped shoulders and ink-stained fingers of a lifelong scholar. His study, located in the rectory's oldest wing, was a remarkable collection of books, manuscripts, and archaeological specimens that rivaled many university libraries. When Hartwell introduced himself and explained his interest in the abbey's history, Ashworth's initial cordiality gave way to an expression of grave concern. "St. Dunstan's Abbey," the old clergyman repeated slowly, as if tasting the words. "I had hoped that particular subject might remain buried. Are you quite certain you wish to pursue this line of inquiry, Dr. Hartwell? Some historical investigations lead to knowledge that is uncomfortable to possess." When Hartwell assured him that his need for information was urgent and pressing, Ashworth sighed deeply and moved to a locked cabinet that stood in the darkest corner of the study. From this repository he withdrew a slim volume bound in black leather, its covers unmarked save for a small silver cross embossed near the spine. "This," he said, handling the book with obvious reverence and fear, "is the private journal of my predecessor, the Reverend Dr. James Pemberton, who served this parish from 1840 to 1875. Dr. Pemberton took a particular interest in the abbey's history, an interest that, I believe, cost him his life and very nearly his soul." The journal proved to be a meticulous record of historical research conducted over a period of nearly 30 years. Dr. Pemberton had been a man of formidable scholarship, combining extensive archival work with careful excavation of the abbey ruins and interviews with the oldest inhabitants of the region. What emerged from his investigations was a picture of the dissolved monastery that differed markedly from the conventional historical narrative. According to Pemberton's research, St. Dunstan's Abbey had acquired an unsavory reputation even before the arrival of the mysterious White Cannon. Founded in the 12th century, it had quickly become associated with heterodox practices and theological innovations that put it at odds with mainstream religious authority. Several abbots had been investigated by episcopal authorities on charges of heresy, and there were persistent rumors of secret rituals conducted in the abbey's extensive underground chambers. The crypt system beneath St. Dunstan's was apparently far more extensive than the architectural plans suggested. Pemberton's journal contained detailed sketches based on local folklore and his own limited explorations, showing a network of natural caverns that had been expanded and modified over the centuries. These underground spaces were said to contain chambers that predated the abbey itself, remnants of some pagan shrine or Roman temple that had occupied the site in ancient times. The old religion never truly died in this place, Pemberton had written in one particularly disturbing passage. It merely went underground, literally and figuratively, waiting for circumstances that would allow it to resurface. When the White Canon arrived at St. Dunstan's in 1537, he found not a Christian monastery, but a place where the boundaries between the sacred and the profane had long since been blurred beyond recognition. Hartwell looked up from the journal to find Dr. Ashworth watching him with an expression of deep anxiety. "You must understand," the rector said quietly, "that Dr. Pemberton was not a man given to flights of fancy or supernatural speculation. He was a careful scholar and a devout Christian. What he describes in those pages, he believed to be literal truth." The journal's account of the White Canon's activities was far more detailed than anything Hartwell had found in the abbey documents themselves. According to Pemberton's research, Frater Albus had not been merely a scholar of forbidden knowledge, but an active practitioner of necromantic arts. Using the abbey's already compromised spiritual atmosphere and its extensive crypt system, he had established what amounted to a school of dark learning, teaching selected monks the techniques of communicating with and commanding the dead. Brother Benedict, the terrified young monk whose fragmentary notes had so disturbed Hartwell, had apparently been the White Canon's most promising pupil. The journal contained transcriptions of Benedict's confessional statements, made to a visiting bishop just weeks before the abbey's dissolution. These confessions spoke of rituals involving the exhumation and reanimation of corpses, of conversations with spirits that had been dead for centuries, and of a grand design to extend the White Canon's influence far beyond the walls of St. Dunstan's. The White Canon spoke of creating a new order. Benedict was quoted as saying, "Not of living monks, but of the undead, who would serve God, or what he called God, throughout eternity, without the weaknesses of mortal flesh." He showed us texts written in languages that hurt the mind to read, and taught us words of power that could compel the dead to rise from their graves. The dissolution of the abbey had interrupted these plans, but not before the White Canon had completed certain crucial preparations. According to Pemberton's research, Frater Albus had used his own death. Whether natural or self-induced remained unclear, as the final element in a great working designed to bind his essence to the abbey site permanently. His physical remains had been interred in a specially prepared niche within the deepest part of the crypt, surrounded by protective symbols and sealed with rituals that were intended to preserve his consciousness beyond bodily death. He succeeded all too well. Pemberton had written in one of his final entries, "Death did not end the White Canon's existence, but transformed it into something far more dangerous. Freed from the constraints of mortal flesh, he became a force of pure will and malevolent intelligence, waiting only for the right circumstances to resume his interrupted work." The circumstances that would allow the White Canon's return were apparently quite specific. According to the traditions Pemberton had collected from local sources, the entity could only manifest when someone with the proper knowledge deliberately sought to disturb his rest. The reading of certain texts, the handling of particular artifacts, or the performance of specific rituals could weaken the barriers that held him in check. "This explains," Dr. Ashworth interjected gravely, "why the abbey documents have remained largely unstudied since the dissolution. Those few scholars who have attempted to examine them in detail have invariably encountered difficulties that discouraged further investigation." He went on to describe the fate of several previous researchers who had delved too deeply into the abbey's secrets. There had been the antiquary Cornelius Ashford in 1847, whose excavations in the abbey ruins had been abandoned after he suffered what his contemporaries described as a complete nervous collapse. Local tradition held that Ashford had actually breached the seal of the White Canon's tomb and had been driven mad by what he found there. More recently, Colonel Blackwood himself had fallen victim to the Abbey's malevolent influence. According to Dr. Ashworth, the Colonel's death had been preceded by weeks of increasingly erratic behavior, during which he spoke obsessively of hearing voices from beneath the manor and claimed to be receiving visitations from figures in white robes. The night before he died, Ashworth said quietly, "Colonel Blackwood came to me in a state of extreme agitation. He claimed that he had been summoned to complete some great work that had been left unfinished centuries ago. He spoke of doors that must be opened and seals that must be broken. When I tried to reason with him, he became violent and had to be restrained by his servants. The Colonel's death had occurred under mysterious circumstances. He had been found in his study, surrounded by the scattered Abbey documents, with an expression of such terror frozen on his face that the servants who discovered him had fled the room in panic. The official cause of death had been listed as heart failure, but those who saw the body spoke of other, more disturbing details: fingernails torn and bloody as if he had been clawing at something, and strange marks on his throat that resembled the prints of skeletal fingers. The White Canon is growing stronger," Dr. Ashworth concluded grimly. "Each time someone disturbs his rest, each time the old barriers are weakened, his influence in the world of the living increases. I fear that your investigations, however well-intentioned, may have provided him with the opportunity he has been waiting for." As if summoned by these ominous words, the afternoon light filtering through the rectory windows began to fade. Despite the early hour, the temperature in the study dropped perceptibly, and both men became aware of a presence that had not been there moments before. The books on the shelves began to stir and rustle, as if turned by invisible hands, and a sound like distant chanting rose from somewhere beneath their feet. Dr. Ashworth rose from his chair with movements that betrayed his advanced years, his face pale but determined. "He knows we speak of him," the rector said quietly. "The very act of discussing his history gives him strength. You must leave this place at once, Dr. Hartwell, and you must abandon your investigations immediately." But even as the old clergyman spoke these words, both men knew that it was already too late. The chanting grew louder and more distinct, and with it came the unmistakable scent of grave earth and decay. The shadows in the study's corners began to deepen and coalesce, taking on suggestion of human form draped in flowing robes. "Frater Albus comes," Dr. Ashworth whispered, his scholarly composure finally cracking under the weight of supernatural terror. "God help us, he walks among the living once again." The manifestation that followed was even more terrifying than Hartwell's previous encounter at the manor. The White Canon appeared not as a shadow, but as a figure of horrible solidity, his decayed features clearly visible beneath the cowl of his ancient habit. When he spoke, his voice carried the authority of centuries and the promise of damnation. "The seals weaken, and the barriers crumble. Soon the great work shall be completed, and death itself shall be conquered. You have served me well, little scholar, though you knew it not. Continue to serve, and you shall know rewards beyond mortal comprehension. Resist, and you shall learn that there are fates far worse than death." With these words, the apparition began to fade, but not before making a gesture that sent every book in the study flying from its shelf in a whirlwind of paper and binding. When the chaos finally subsided and normal light returned to the room, Hartwell and Dr. Ashworth found themselves surrounded by the wreckage of a lifetime's scholarship. But among the scattered volumes, one book lay open at their feet: Pemberton's journal. Its pages turned to a passage that neither man had read before. In the failing light, they bent to examine this final revelation, and what they read there filled them with a horror that transcended anything they had yet experienced. The White Canon's ultimate purpose, the passage began, is not merely to return from death, but to break down the barriers between the living and the dead entirely. Using the Abbey site as a focal point, he intends to create a permanent breach in the natural order, allowing the restless dead of centuries to walk freely in the world of the living. The dissolution of the Abbey only delayed this plan, it did not end it. The journal went on to describe signs and portents that would herald the White Canon's final triumph: the spontaneous opening of graves, the appearance of spectral figures in the countryside, and the gradual weakening of the boundary between natural and supernatural. Most ominous of all, the completion of his great work would require the willing cooperation of a living person, someone who had been drawn into his web of influence and corrupted by exposure to his malevolent power. As Hartwell read these words, he felt a cold certainty settling in his heart. He had been chosen, marked by his investigations and his encounters with the White Canon's influence. Whether he willed it or not, he had become an essential part of the entity's plan for resurrection and revenge. The hints of the past had become a road map to a horrifying future, and Hartwell realized with growing dread that he was no longer merely investigating a historical mystery. He had become the key figure in a supernatural drama that had been for centuries in the making. The White Canon's time was coming, and all the forces of darkness were gathering for his triumphant return to the world of the living. The journey back to Greystone Manor through the gathering dusk was one of the most harrowing experiences of Hartwell's life. The familiar Norfolk countryside seemed transformed by his new knowledge of the White Canon's influence, every shadow potentially concealing some manifestation of supernatural malevolence. The very air itself felt charged with an electric tension that spoke of approaching storm, not the natural tempest of wind and rain, but something far more ominous and otherworldly. Dr. Ashworth had insisted on accompanying him despite his advanced years, the old rector's sense of Christian duty overriding his obvious terror of what they might encounter. "If the White Canon has indeed marked you as his instrument," he had said while gathering certain items from his study, a silver crucifix, a vial of holy water, and a leather-bound prayer book that had belonged to his predecessor, "then you will need all the spiritual protection that can be mustered." As their motorcar approached the manor's gates, both men became aware of changes in the building's appearance that were subtle but deeply unsettling. The windows, which should have glowed warmly with lamplight in the gathering darkness, instead seemed to emanate a cold, bluish radiance that flickered and danced like foxfire. The very architecture appeared somehow different, more angular, more threatening, as if the Tudor brickwork had twisted itself into configurations that hurt the eye to contemplate. Mrs. Blackwood met them at the entrance, with barely controlled panic written across her features. "Thank God you've returned," she said, her voice shaking with relief and terror in equal measure. "The most dreadful things have been happening since you left. The servants are in uproar, and I fear I may have to dismiss the lot of them if this continues." She led them into the drawing room, where a fire burned fitfully in the grate, its flames casting dancing shadows that seemed to move with independent malevolence. As she spoke, her account of the day's events painted a picture of a household in the grip of supernatural siege. It had begun, she explained, shortly after Hartwell's departure for the village. The servants had reported hearing voices from empty rooms, doors that opened and closed of their own accord, and the sound of footsteps in corridors where no living person walked. Young Sarah, the housemaid, had claimed to see a figure in white robes gliding through the gallery, and had fled the house in hysterics, refusing to return. But the most disturbing incidents had centered on the library itself. Throughout the day, the Abbey documents had displayed increasingly erratic behavior, pages turning without any apparent cause, text appearing and disappearing on the ancient vellum, and temperatures dropping so severely that frost had formed on the windows. Despite the mild weather outside, Graves tried to maintain order. Mrs. Blackwood continued, her hands trembling as she reached for her teacup. But even he was forced to abandon his post when the sounds began. The sounds she described were like nothing in earthly experience, a low, rhythmic chanting that seemed to rise from the very foundations of the building, accompanied by a scraping noise as of stone coffin lids being dragged across marble floors. Most terrifying of all had been the voices that accompanied these manifestations. Not the single whisper Hartwell had encountered before, but a chorus of the dead speaking in Latin and languages that predated recorded history. Dr. Ashworth listened to this account with growing alarm, occasionally consulting the prayer book he carried, and muttering what appeared to be protective incantations under his breath. When Mrs. Blackwood had finished her narrative, he turned to Hartwell with an expression of grave concern. "The manifestations are accelerating," he said quietly. "The White Canon's influence is growing stronger by the hour." If we are to have any hope of containing this evil, we must act tonight, before his power becomes too great to oppose." They were interrupted at this moment by the arrival of Graves, the elderly butler, looking far older than his years and moving with the careful precision of a man, fighting to maintain his composure. "Begging your pardon," he said, his voice carefully controlled, "but I thought you should know that the disturbances in the library have intensified since your return." Even as he spoke, a sound echoed through the manor that made all four occupants of the drawing room freeze in terror. It was a voice unmistakably the White Canon's harsh whisper, calling out from the direction of the library wing, "Come, little scholar, come and complete what you have begun. The seals weaken and the barriers crumble. Come and claim your reward for faithful service." The voice seemed to penetrate every corner of the house, echoing through walls and floors with supernatural resonance. As it faded, they became aware of other sounds rising from the depths of the building, the rhythmic tapping that had become so familiar, now accompanied by what sounded like the creaking of ancient wooden doors and the rustle of burial shrouds. Dr. Ashworth rose from his chair with determination that belied his obvious fear. "We must confront this evil directly," he declared, clutching his prayer book with white-knuckled intensity. To delay further is to risk the complete breakdown of the natural order. But as they prepared to make their way to the library, the manifestations took on a new and more terrifying dimension. The temperature throughout the manor began to plummet, and their breath became visible in the suddenly frigid air. The electric lights flickered and dimmed, leaving them dependent on the uncertain illumination of candles and oil lamps. Most disturbing of all, they became aware that they were no longer alone in the drawing room. Shadows began to coalesce in the corners, not the single figure of the White Canon, but multiple forms that suggested the presence of other entities, other inhabitants of whatever realm the medieval necromancer had opened through his blasphemous arts. These shadow figures moved with the slow, deliberate gait of the long dead, their forms suggesting monastic robes that hung in tatters from skeletal frames. As they drew closer, details became horribly clear, faces that were little more than skull and sinew, eye sockets that burned with points of cold light, and hands that ended in fingers like yellowed bone. "The Brethren of St. Dunstan," Dr. Ashworth whispered in recognition and horror. "The White Canon has summoned his undead congregation." The spectral monks ranged themselves in a rough circle round the living occupants of the room, their eyeless gazes fixed with unmistakable menace. When they spoke, their voices formed a chorus of the damned that seemed to shake the very foundations of reality. "Join us, scholar of earthly learning. Take your place among those who have transcended the limitations of mortal flesh. The White Canon offers gifts beyond imagination, knowledge that spans the centuries, power that conquers death itself." One of the figures, perhaps Brother Benedict himself, judging by the youth suggested in its withered features, separated itself from the group and approached Hartwell directly. When it spoke, its voice carried a note of desperate pleading that was somehow more terrifying than outright menace. "Do not resist, brother. I fought against the White Canon's will for months, and the agony of that struggle was beyond description. Accept what must be, and know peace in submission to a power greater than life or death." As the spectral monk reached toward him with skeletal fingers, Hartwell felt his will beginning to waver. The accumulated terror and exhaustion of recent days had left him vulnerable to supernatural influence, and there was something seductive in the promise of ending his struggle, of accepting whatever fate the White Canon had planned for him. It was Dr. Ashworth who broke the spell, stepping forward with his crucifix raised and beginning to recite words of exorcism in a voice that carried the authority of absolute faith. The spectral figures recoiled as if struck by physical blows, their forms wavering and becoming less distinct. "In the name of Jesus Christ," the old rector intoned, "I command you to return to the depths from which you came. By the power of the Holy Spirit, I bind you to trouble the living no more." The undead monks retreated before his advance, but their withdrawal was clearly temporary rather than permanent. As they faded back into shadow, their leader, whether Benedict or another of the White Canon's victims, spoke words that chilled the blood of all who heard them. The barriers weaken with each passing hour. Soon neither prayer nor holy water will avail against our Master's will. The great work nears completion, and all shall serve in death as they refused to serve in life. As the manifestation ended and normal temperature began to return to the room, the 4 living occupants found themselves shaken to their very cores by what they had witnessed. The White Cannon was no longer content with mere threats and warnings. He was actively recruiting agents from among the dead to further his purposes. "The situation is far worse than I feared," Dr. Ashworth said grimly, sinking back into his chair with evident exhaustion. "The White Cannon has not merely preserved his own existence beyond death. He has built an army of the damned, and he intends to use it to break down the barriers between the living and the dead permanently." Mrs. Blackwood, who had remained silent throughout the encounter, finally found her voice. "What can we do?" she asked desperately. "How does one fight against such evil?" Before Dr. Ashworth could reply, they were interrupted by a new sound from the library, not the familiar chanting or tapping, but something that made their blood run cold with its implications. It was the sound of stone grinding against stone, as of massive blocks being moved by invisible hands. "The seals," Hartwell whispered in sudden, terrible understanding. "He's breaking the seals that bind him to his tomb." Even as he spoke, they could feel the change in the manor's atmosphere. The oppressive weight of supernatural presence was lifting slightly, not because the danger was diminishing, but because something that had been confined was beginning to break free. The White Cannon was no longer content to manifest as a shadow or spectral presence. He was preparing to walk among the living in his own renewed flesh. The first ominous manifestation had passed, but it had been merely a prelude to horrors yet to come. The real confrontation, the final battle between the forces of light and the ancient evil that had slumbered beneath Greystone Manor was about to begin. And as the sound of grinding stone continued to echo through the night, all present knew that before another dawn broke over the Norfolk countryside, they would either triumph over the White Cannon's malevolent power or join the ranks of his undead servants for all eternity. The remainder of that terrible night passed in a state of siege, with the manor's living occupants huddled together in the drawing room while supernatural forces gathered their strength in the darkness. Beyond, Dr. Ashworth had arranged protective measures as best he could. Crosses placed at every entrance, lines of salt drawn across thresholds, and prayers of protection recited at regular intervals, but all present understood that these defenses were temporary at best. The sounds from the library continued throughout the small hours, growing progressively more violent and disturbing. The grinding of stone gave way to crashes and impacts that shook the entire building, as if massive weights were being hurled against the walls. Interspersed with these physical manifestations came voices, not just the White Cannon's harsh whisper, but a chorus of the dead that seemed to include every soul that had ever fallen under his malevolent influence. By dawn, the occupants of the drawing room presented a pitiful sight. Mrs. Blackwood had succumbed to nervous exhaustion and lay unconscious on the sofa, her breathing shallow and labored. Graves sat rigidly upright in his chair, his weathered features set in an expression of grim determination that could not entirely conceal his underlying terror. Dr. Ashworth continued to maintain his vigil with prayer book and crucifix, though the strain of the night's events had clearly taken a severe toll on his aged constitution. Hartwell himself felt as though he were balanced on the edge of a precipice, his sanity held in place only by the thinnest of threads. The accumulated horror of recent days had pushed him far beyond the limits of rational endurance, and he found himself struggling against an almost overwhelming urge to walk to the library and surrender himself to whatever fate the White Cannon had prepared for him. It was the cessation of sound from the library wing that finally roused them from their exhausted stupor. The grinding and crashing that had continued throughout the night stopped abruptly as the first rays of sunlight penetrated the drawing room windows, leaving behind a silence that was somehow more ominous than the previous cacophony. "He rests during daylight hours," Dr. Ashworth explained weakly, noting Hartwell's questioning glance. "The old legends speak of such creatures being bound by the cycles of sun and moon, but each night his power grows stronger, and I fear that these natural limitations will not constrain him much longer." Mrs. Blackwood stirred and opened her eyes, looking around the room with the confused expression of one awakening from a terrible nightmare. "Is it over?" she asked hopefully, but the grim faces that surrounded her provided answer enough. A tentative exploration of the manor in the gray morning light revealed the extent of the previous night's supernatural assault. The library wing showed signs of tremendous disturbance, furniture overturned, books scattered across the floors, and the very walls bearing strange markings that hurt the eyes to look upon directly. The Abbey documents themselves had been arranged in complex patterns that suggested ritual significance, their ancient vellum glowing with a faint phosphorescence that spoke of unholy energies. Most disturbing of all was the discovery that structural changes had occurred during the night. The floor of the library showed signs of upheaval, with several flagstones displaced as if something of tremendous size had been pressing upward from beneath. Through the gaps thus created, they could glimpse the darkness of spaces that should not have existed, chambers and passages that the manor's architectural plans made no provision for. The barriers between the manor and the Abbey's crypt system have been breached, Dr. Ashworth observed grimly. The White Canon has opened a direct pathway between his tomb and the world above. Tonight, when darkness falls again, I fear he will complete his resurrection. The day passed in desperate preparation for what all recognized would be a final confrontation. Dr. Ashworth sent urgent messages to his clerical colleagues, summoning what aid he could from the church hierarchy, though whether such assistance would arrive in time remained doubtful. Mrs. Blackwood attempted to contact the local authorities, but found herself unable to explain the situation in terms that would not result in immediate dismissal as hysteria. Meanwhile, Hartwell found himself drawn repeatedly to the library despite the obvious danger. The Abbey documents seemed to exert an increasingly powerful fascination, and he discovered that he could read passages that had previously been incomprehensible, as if exposure to the White Canon's influence had somehow enhanced his scholarly abilities. The knowledge thus gained was both exhilarating and terrifying, revealing secrets of the ancient world that no living man should possess. It was during one of these compulsive visits to the library that Hartwell made the discovery that would prove central to the night's events. Hidden within the binding of the chronicle, revealed only when the manuscript structure had been damaged by the previous night's supernatural violence, he found a single sheet of parchment covered with symbols that seemed to writhe and shift before his eyes. The document appeared to be some form of protective charm or counterspell, written in a mixture of Latin and older languages that predated the Christian era. As Hartwell struggled to decipher its meaning, he became aware that he was not alone in the library. A figure had materialized in the doorway, not the White Canon himself, but one of the spectral monks from the previous night's manifestation. The undead creature approached with slow, measured steps, its tattered robes rustling like dry leaves. When it spoke, its voice carried a note of urgent warning that seemed at odds with its horrifying appearance. Do not read those words, living one. They were written by the last abbot of St. Dunstan in the final hours before the dissolution. He sought to bind the White Canon permanently, but his efforts only succeeded in delaying the inevitable. To speak those syllables now would bring consequences beyond your comprehension. But even as the spectral monk delivered this warning, Hartwell felt compelled to continue his examination of the mysterious document. The symbols seemed to pulse with their own inner light, and he found himself beginning to understand their meaning through some process that bypassed conscious thought entirely. The binding spell, he whispered in sudden comprehension. This is the ritual that was meant to contain the White Canon permanently, but it was never completed. The ghostly figure before him nodded slowly, its skull-like features expressing what might have been regret. Brother Antonius died before the work could be finished. The royal commissioners arrived, the abbey was dissolved, and the White Canon was left with only partial constraints upon his power. For centuries he has waited, growing stronger, planning his return. Tonight, when the barriers are weakest, he will break free completely. Unless the binding is completed, Hartwell said, the full implications of his discovery becoming clear. Unless someone finishes what Brother Antonius began. The spectral monk's reaction was immediate and violent. Its form became more solid, more threatening, as it reached toward Hartwell with skeletal fingers extended like claws. You cannot, it hissed, its voice rising to a shriek that seemed to shake the very air. The White Canon has marked you as his own. You are meant to serve, not to oppose. But Hartwell had already begun to back away from the apparition. Clutching the precious document to his chest, The spectral monk's form wavered and became less distinct as he moved away from the concentrated supernatural influence of the library. And by the time he reached the drawing room, the creature had faded entirely. Dr. Ashworth examined the document with growing excitement and alarm. "This is indeed a binding ritual," he confirmed, his voice trembling with the implications. "But it requires components that would be difficult to obtain, and the risks—" He shook his head gravely. "The consequences of failure would be catastrophic. Not only would the White Cannon achieve complete freedom, but the attempt itself would likely result in the deaths of all involved." As the afternoon wore on, and the light began to fade from the Norfolk sky, the supernatural pressure within the manor intensified dramatically. The temperature dropped with each passing hour, and the walls themselves seemed to pulse with malevolent energy. Strange lights flickered in empty rooms, doors opened and closed with violent force, and the sound of chanting rose from the depths with increasing volume and complexity. Most ominous of all was the change in Hartwell himself. As darkness approached, he found his resistance to the White Cannon's influence beginning to weaken. Visions flashed through his mind, images of power and knowledge beyond mortal comprehension, of secrets that would make him the master of life and death itself. The temptation to abandon his futile resistance and accept the role that had been prepared for him grew stronger with each passing moment. It was Mrs. Blackwood who first noticed the physical changes that were beginning to manifest. "Dr. Hartwell," she said with barely controlled terror, "your eyes, they're beginning to glow," looking in the mirror above the fireplace. Hartwell saw with horror that his reflection showed eyes that burned with the same cold light he had seen in the spectral monks. His skin had taken on a pallid, waxy quality, and when he spoke, his voice carried subtle harmonics that had not been there before. "The transformation has begun," Dr. Ashworth said grimly. "The White Cannon is preparing you to serve as his agent in the world of the living. Soon you will be neither fully alive nor properly dead, but something caught between the two states, a creature of terrible power and complete servitude to his will." The dread that filled the manor as night fell was unlike anything in mortal experience. Every shadow seemed to conceal watching eyes, every sound spoke of approaching doom. The barriers between the natural and supernatural worlds were wearing thin, and through the growing cracks, forces of unimaginable malevolence were beginning to seep into the realm of the living. As the clock in the hall chimed 9, the final phase of the White Cannon's long-delayed resurrection began. The sounds from beneath the manor rose to a crescendo of supernatural fury, and the very foundations of the building shook as something vast and terrible stirred in the depths below. The growing dread had reached its peak, and the time for half measures and temporizing had passed. Before another hour had elapsed, the fate of all present would be decided, and with it, perhaps, the fate of the entire world. For if the White Cannon succeeded in breaking free completely, his influence would spread far beyond the confines of Greystone Manor, and the ancient evil that had slumbered beneath Norfolk soil would awaken to plague the earth once more. As the clock struck 10, the manor shuddered as if struck by an earthquake, and from the library came a sound unlike anything in earthly experience, a howl of triumph that seemed to contain the voices of the damned throughout all history. The lights throughout the building flickered and died, leaving the occupants of the drawing room dependent on the wavering illumination of candles that burned with flames of unnatural blue and silver. Dr. Ashworth rose from his chair with movements that betrayed his advanced years, his face set in lines of grim determination. "The final phase begins," he said quietly, clutching his prayer book with hands that shook only slightly. "Whatever we are to do, we must do it now, before his power becomes absolute." But even as the old rector spoke these words, it became clear that their options for action were rapidly diminishing. The doorways of the drawing room had begun to fill with shadow figures, not the individual spectral monks they had encountered before, but a multitude of undead forms that pressed forward with mindless hunger. These were not the White Cannon's willing servants, but the ravening hordes of the dead that his breaking of natural law had released from whatever restraints had previously bound them. Mrs. Blackwood had awakened from her exhausted stupor and was staring at the approaching apparitions with the wide-eyed terror of someone whose sanity balanced on a knife's edge. Graves stood protectively before her, The elderly butler's weathered features set in an expression of defiant courage that would have been admirable under other circumstances. It was Hartwell himself who posed the greatest immediate danger to the group's survival. The transformation that had begun during the afternoon was accelerating rapidly, and he found himself fighting against an almost overwhelming compulsion to join the ranks of the undead that surrounded them. His vision had taken on an otherworldly clarity that revealed details invisible to mortal sight, and when he spoke, his voice carried harmonics that resonated with supernatural power. "I can see him," Hartwell said, his altered voice carrying through the room with unnatural clarity. "The White Canon rises from his tomb, and with him comes knowledge that spans the centuries. He offers such gifts, such power over life and death itself." Dr. Ashworth seized his shoulders with surprising strength, forcing Hartwell to meet his gaze. "Fight against his influence," the rector commanded urgently. "Remember your humanity, your connection to the world of the living. The power he offers is a lie, a trap that has claimed countless souls throughout the ages." But even as Ashworth spoke these words of encouragement, the true scope of the White Canon's malevolent design was revealing itself. Through the supernatural chaos that engulfed the manor, the undead forms that pressed against the drawing room's boundaries were not random manifestations of evil, but part of a carefully orchestrated plan that had been centuries in the making. Through Hartwell's enhanced perception, the truth became horribly clear. The White Canon had never intended merely to return from death. His ultimate goal was nothing less than the complete breakdown of the barriers between the living and the dead. Using the Abbey site as a focal point and the manor as a conduit, he was opening a permanent breach in the natural order that would allow the restless dead of centuries to walk freely among the living. "The dissolution," Hartwell whispered in sudden, terrible understanding. It wasn't just about suppressing religious dissent, it was about preventing this. The royal commissioners knew what he was attempting, and they acted to stop him. But they only delayed the inevitable. The spectral forms surrounding them seemed to sense his growing comprehension, and their advance became more urgent and aggressive. But these were not the White Canon's disciplined servants. They were the chaotic masses of the unquiet dead, driven by hungers and hatreds that transcended rational thought. Their very presence in the world of the living was causing reality itself to break down, creating pockets of supernatural chaos where the normal laws of existence no longer applied. Through the manor's walls, they could hear sounds that spoke of widespread devastation. Windows shattered without cause, doors burst from their hinges, and the very structure of the building began to warp and twist as if the architecture itself were rebelling against the forces that had been unleashed within it. "The binding spell," Dr. Ashworth said urgently, pulling the ancient document from his robes where he had kept it safe. "Throughout the day's preparations, if we are to have any hope of stopping this catastrophe, we must attempt the ritual that Brother Antonius died trying to complete." But the components required for the binding were not all present, and the conditions necessary for its successful performance were far from ideal. The ritual demanded specific materials sought from blessed ground, water that had never seen moonlight, and most critically, the willing sacrifice of someone who had been touched by the White Canon's power, but had not yet fallen completely under his dominion. "The sacrifice," Hartwell said, his transformed voice carrying a note of terrible clarity. "It must be me. I am the one he has marked, the one whose corruption he has begun but not completed. Only through my willing death can the binding be made permanent." Dr. Ashworth recoiled from this suggestion with obvious horror. "There must be another way," he protested. "To deliberately court such a fate goes against every principle of Christian faith." But even as the old rector spoke these words, the supernatural assault on the drawing room intensified. The spectral figures had begun to solidify, taking on more definite and threatening forms. Their leader, a tall figure in the tattered remains of episcopal vestments, stepped forward with movements that suggested both authority and malevolent purpose. "I am Dom Thomas Cranfield," the apparition intoned, its voice carrying the hollow resonance of the tomb. "Last abbot of St. Dunstan, and first among the White Canon's willing servants. For centuries I have awaited this night, when the great work would finally be completed." The spectral abbot's revelation sent a chill through the assembled living occupants that transcended physical cold. According to the historical records, Dom Thomas had been one of the White Canon's most vocal opponents, fighting against the necromancer's influence until the abbey's final dissolution. To discover that he had ultimately succumbed to corruption, cast doubt on everything they thought they understood about the past. You were wrong to resist him, the ghostly abbot continued, his eyeless gaze fixed on Dr. Ashworth with unmistakable menace. The White Canon offered gifts beyond imagination, knowledge that spans the ages, power that conquers death itself. Those who serve him willingly are rewarded beyond measure. Those who oppose him suffer eternally. As if to demonstrate this point, other figures began to materialize around the spectral abbot, forms that had clearly once been human but had been transformed by centuries of supernatural torture into things that barely retained the semblance of their former selves. Their agonized moans filled the air with a symphony of despair that spoke of punishments beyond mortal comprehension. Brother Antonius, one of these wretched figures, whispered, its voice barely recognizable as human. He tried to complete the binding, tried to contain the master's power. Now he writhes in torments that know no end. While we who submitted early enjoy the rewards of faithful service, the psychological pressure of this revelation was enormous. If even the most devout and learned opponents of the White Canon had ultimately fallen to his influence, what hope did mere mortals have of resisting his power? Mrs. Blackwood had begun to weep quietly, her composure finally cracking under the weight of supernatural terror. Graves maintained his protective stance, but his weathered features showed the strain of a man pushed beyond his limits of endurance. It was at this moment of maximum despair that Hartwell made his crucial discovery. The transformation that had been working within him throughout the day had not merely enhanced his perception of supernatural phenomena, it had also given him access to knowledge that the White Canon had intended to keep hidden. Through this unwilling communion with ancient evil, he could see the true structure of the necromancer's power and, more importantly, its weaknesses. The binding ritual, he said suddenly, his voice cutting through the chorus of spectral voices like a blade. Brother Antonius was wrong about the components. The sacrifice isn't necessary. What's needed is someone who can serve as a conduit for the spell while maintaining their connection to both worlds. Dr. Ashworth looked at him with a mixture of hope and alarm. What are you saying? The White Canon's power comes from his ability to exist simultaneously in the realm of the living and the realm of the dead, Hartwell explained rapidly, feeling his time growing short as the transformation accelerated. But that same duality makes him vulnerable. Someone who shares that condition, someone who has been partially transformed but retains their human will, can turn his own power against him. The spectral figures surrounding them seemed to sense the danger in this revelation, and their advance became more urgent and desperate. The ghostly abbot raised one skeletal hand, and when he spoke, his voice carried the authority of centuries of accumulated malevolence. You understand nothing, mortal fool. The transformation cannot be reversed, and the binding cannot be completed. The White Canon's power has grown beyond all mortal opposition. Submit now, and no mercy in servitude. Continue to resist, and join the ranks of the eternally tormented. But Hartwell was no longer listening to the threats and promises of the undead. His enhanced perception had revealed the true nature of the Abbey documents, and with growing excitement, he realized that they had been carrying the means of the White Canon's defeat all along. The Chronicle, he said urgently, turning to Dr. Ashworth with eyes that burned with supernatural light. It's not just a historical record, it's a grimoire, a book of power disguised as ecclesiastical writing. The illuminated letters, the decorative patterns, they're all part of a great working designed to contain and control supernatural forces. As he spoke these words, the temperature in the room plummeted to Arctic levels, and the spectral figures began to retreat with obvious alarm. The White Canon himself had apparently become aware of this new development, and his fury manifested as a psychic pressure that seemed to crush down upon the living occupants with almost physical force. From the depths of the manor came a howl of rage that shook the very foundations, followed by the sound of massive stone blocks being hurled against unyielding barriers. The necromancer was apparently trapped between his tomb and the upper world, unable to complete his resurrection while his power was being turned against him. Now, Hartwell said desperately, feeling his humanity slipping away with each passing second. We must attempt the binding now, while he is vulnerable. Dr. Ashworth began to recite the Latin phrases from Brother Antonius's incomplete ritual, his voice gaining strength and authority as the ancient words of power rolled from his tongue. Mrs. Blackwood and Graves joined their voices to his, though neither understood the meaning of what they spoke. The spectral figures surrounding them began to waver and fade, their connection to the material world weakening as the binding took effect. But the ritual required more than mere recitation. It demanded a focus, for the supernatural energies being unleashed, someone who could channel and direct the forces that were tearing at the fabric of reality itself. As the only person present who existed simultaneously in both worlds, that responsibility fell inevitably to Hartwell, fighting against the White Canon's influence with every remaining fiber of his human will. He reached out to grasp the Chronicle of St. Dunstan. The moment his fingers touched the ancient vellum, the illuminated letters began to glow with their own inner light, and the decorative patterns started to move and shift like living things. The pain was indescribable, not merely physical agony, but a spiritual torment that seemed to tear his very soul apart. Through his connection to the Chronicle, he could feel the full weight of the White Canon's malevolent power pressing down upon him, seeking to crush his resistance and complete the transformation that would make him a willing servant of ancient evil. But he could also feel something else, the accumulated prayers and hopes of all those who had opposed the necromancer. Throughout the centuries, the spiritual strength of countless souls who had died rather than submit to his dominion. Brother Antonius was there, and the true Dom Thomas Cranfield, and dozens of others who had given their lives to prevent this night from coming to pass. Complete the binding, their voices whispered through the centuries. Finish what we began and give meaning to our sacrifice. With the last of his human strength, Hartwell spoke the final words of the ritual, his voice joining with those of the long-dead heroes who had opposed the White Canon's evil. The Chronicle burst into flames that burned without consuming, and through that supernatural fire, the truth of the Abbey's history was finally revealed. The White Canon's power was broken, his connection to the world of the living severed by the completed binding. The spectral figures that had surrounded them dissolved like mist before the morning sun, their agonized forms finding peace at last in the oblivion they had been denied for so long. But the cost of victory was terrible. As the ritual reached its climax, Hartwell felt his transformed nature tear itself apart, caught between the conflicting forces of life and death that no mortal frame could contain. His last coherent thought was a prayer that his sacrifice would be sufficient to ensure that the White Canon's evil would never again threaten the world of the living. The unveiling was complete, and with it came the knowledge that some victories can only be purchased with the ultimate price. In the moments following the completion of the binding ritual, an eerie stillness settled over Greystone Manor that was more profound than mere absence of sound. It was as if the very air itself had been drained of vitality, leaving behind a vacuum that seemed to press against the eardrums with almost physical weight. The spectral figures that had threatened them moments before had vanished completely, dissolved by the power of the ancient working that had finally reached its intended culmination. Dr. Ashworth lowered his prayer book with hands that trembled from exhaustion and relief, his aged features bearing the marks of a spiritual ordeal that had pushed him to the very limits of his endurance. Mrs. Blackwood sat slumped in her chair, her breathing shallow but steady, while Graves maintained his protective stance, despite obvious bewilderment at the supernatural forces he had witnessed. But it was Hartwell who commanded the most immediate attention, for the completion of the binding ritual had left him suspended between life and death in a state that defied natural law. His physical form remained present in the material world, but his eyes had taken on the vacant quality of one whose consciousness resided elsewhere. When he spoke, his voice carried harmonics that seemed to echo from vast distances. "It is not finished," he said, his words cutting through the stillness like a blade. "The binding has weakened him, but the White Canon endures, for centuries of accumulated power cannot be so easily dismissed." Even as he spoke these ominous words, the temperature in the drawing room began to plummet once again, and frost formed on the windows despite the normal autumn weather outside. But this manifestation differed from their previous encounters with supernatural cold. Instead of the sharp, shocking drop they had experienced before, this was a gradual, creeping chill that seemed to leach warmth from their very bones. From somewhere deep beneath the manor came a sound unlike anything they had heard before. Not the familiar chanting or rhythmic tapping, but a low, sustained note that seemed to vibrate through the very foundations of the building. It was a sound of such profound malevolence that hearing it felt like a violation of the natural order, as if reality itself were being forced to accommodate something that should never have existed. "He comes," Hartwell whispered, his transformed perception allowing him to see what remained hidden from mortal senses. "The binding has not destroyed him, only forced him to manifest in his true form. What approaches is no longer the shadow or spirit we encountered before, but the White Kennan himself, risen from his tomb in all his ancient horror." The sound from below grew louder and more complex, developing into what might have been singing if voices from beyond the grave could truly be said to sing. It was a melody that predated Christianity, that perhaps predated human civilization itself, a hymn to powers and principalities that ruled in the darkness between the stars. As this unholy chorus rose to its crescendo, structural changes began to occur throughout the manor. Walls that had stood for centuries started to crack and buckle, not from any physical force, but from the sheer presence of something that reality itself struggled to contain. Doorways warped into shapes that hurt the eye to contemplate, and passages opened where none had existed before, revealing glimpses of spaces that belonged neither to the Tudor manor nor to any earthly architecture. "The barriers between dimensions are breaking down," Dr. Ashworth observed with the detached fascination of a scholar even in the face of ultimate horror. "His manifestation is causing reality itself to fracture around him." Through these temporal and spatial distortions came evidence of the White Kennan's approach, not footsteps, for such things were beneath his transformed nature, but a presence that announced itself through the distortion of natural law. Plants withered at his passing, metal corroded in moments, and the very air seemed to thicken with the weight of accumulated centuries. It was Mrs. Blackwood who first saw him, her terrified gasp drawing the attention of the others to the doorway of the drawing room. What stood there bore only the most superficial resemblance to anything human, a figure draped in robes that seemed to be woven from shadow and decay, beneath which lurked a form that the mind refused to properly perceive. The White Kennan had indeed risen from his tomb, but for centuries of unnatural existence had transformed him into something that challenged every conception of life and death. His face, visible beneath the cowl of his ancient habit, was a masterwork of corruption, flesh that had the consistency of wet parchment stretched over bones that gleamed with their own phosphorescent light. His eyes were voids that seemed to contain the accumulated darkness of eternity, and when he smiled, his teeth were revealed to be fragments of yellowed stone carved with symbols that predated written language. "Greetings, faithful servants," he said, his voice carrying the resonance of tomb doors grinding open and coffin lids sliding aside. "Your efforts to bind me have been instructive. I had forgotten how delicious mortal terror could be, how exquisite the despair of those who believe themselves capable of opposing powers beyond their comprehension." His gaze fixed upon Hartwell with obvious satisfaction. "And you, my dear scholar, have exceeded even my considerable expectations. The transformation you have undergone makes you the perfect conduit for my will in the material world. Together, we shall complete the work that was interrupted so rudely for centuries ago." But Hartwell, suspended as he was between life and death, possessed insights that pure mortality could never have achieved. "The binding worked," he said, his voice carrying absolute certainty despite his transformed state. "You are diminished, forced to take physical form in a world that rejects your very existence. You can no longer command the dead as you once did, can no longer break the barriers between worlds at will." The White Kennan's expression shifted from satisfaction to rage with a swiftness that was deeply unsettling. "Impudent mortal," he snarled, raising one skeletal hand in a gesture of unmistakable menace. "I am Frater Albus, master of mysteries that were ancient when your civilization was yet unborn. I have walked in realms that exist beyond space and time, have commanded legions of the dead across the centuries." As he spoke these words of power, The drawing room began to fill with manifestations of his claimed authority. Shadows writhed in the corners, taking on forms that suggested vast, tentacled things from spaces between the stars. The portraits on the walls began to move within their frames, their painted subjects turning to regard the living occupants with expressions of malevolent hunger. Most terrifying of all, the boundaries between the interior of the manor and the ancient crypt system became increasingly permeable, revealing glimpses of stone corridors that stretched away into unimaginable depths. "Behold my domain," the White Canon commanded, gesturing toward these supernatural vistas. "For centuries I have labored to expand my influence, to prepare for this moment when the barriers would finally fall. Every death in this region has strengthened my power. Every act of violence and despair has fed my growing authority over the realm of shadows." Through the dimensional rifts that were opening around them, the living occupants of the drawing room could see the true extent of the White Canon's accumulated might. The crypt system beneath the manor extended far beyond anything suggested by the architectural plans, connecting with a vast network of underground chambers that stretched for miles beneath the Norfolk countryside. Within these spaces moved forms that had once been human, but were human no longer. The accumulated servants of for centuries, bound to his will by bonds stronger than death itself. But most horrifying of all was the realization that these undead legions were merely the beginning of his grand design. As the barriers between dimensions continued to weaken, other things began to emerge, entities from realms where the normal laws of existence held no sway. Creatures of pure malevolence that had been waiting eons for the opportunity to enter the material world. "This is what I offer you," the White Canon said, his voice dropping to a seductive whisper that seemed to bypass conscious thought and speak directly to the soul. "Join with me willingly, and you shall know power beyond imagination. You will walk between worlds as I do, command forces that reshape reality according to your desires. Death will hold no dominion over you, and time itself will be your plaything." The temptation was enormous, particularly for Hartwell, whose transformed state made him especially vulnerable to such supernatural influence. Through his enhanced perception, he could see the truth of the White Canon's promises. The entity did indeed possess power beyond mortal comprehension, knowledge that could unlock the secrets of existence itself. But he could also see the price of such gifts. The undead servants who filled the White Canon's domain were not the willing partners he claimed them to be, but tortured souls trapped in an existence that was neither life nor death, forever bound to serve a master whose very nature was antithetical to everything human. Their agonized expressions spoke of centuries of suffering that made physical torment seem like mercy by comparison. "I refuse," Hartwell said, summoning the last reserves of his human will to resist the supernatural compulsion. "Whatever power you offer is not worth the cost of becoming what you have made yourself, a thing that exists only to spread suffering and corruption." The White Canon's rage at this rejection was terrible to behold. The temperature in the room dropped to levels that should have been fatal, and the very air began to crystallize into patterns of frost that formed symbols of power so ancient and terrible that looking upon them directly threatened to drive the viewer mad. "Then you shall know the fate of all who oppose me," the necromancer shrieked, his voice rising to frequencies that made the windows shatter and the walls crack. "I offered you partnership, but you chose enmity. Now you will learn what it means to defy Frater Albus." The climactic encounter had reached its peak, and as the White Canon raised both hands to unleash whatever final horror he had prepared, all present understood that the next few moments would determine not only their individual fates, but the future of the natural order itself. The ancient evil that had slumbered beneath Norfolk soil for 4 centuries was fully awakened at last, and only the rapidly fading strength of a handful of mortals stood between it and the completion of its blasphemous design. What followed the White Canon's final threat was not the supernatural catastrophe that all expected, but something far more subtle and infinitely more terrible. Instead of unleashing the full force of his accumulated power in a single devastating assault, the ancient necromancer seemed to pause, his terrible features arranging themselves into an expression of cold calculation. "Perhaps," he said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper, direct confrontation is unnecessary. After all, I have waited for centuries. What are a few more decades against such a span? Better to let the seeds I have planted grow to fruition in their own time. As he spoke these ominous words, the dimensional rifts that had been opening around the drawing room began to close, and the manifestations of otherworldly horror faded back into whatever realm they had emerged from. The temperature returned to normal levels, and the structural damage to the manor seemed to reverse itself as if by magic. But the White Canon himself remained, his physical presence a constant reminder that the danger had not passed, but merely changed its nature. "I withdraw for now," he continued, his void-like gaze moving from one terrified face to another. "But my influence will remain. Each of you has been touched by my power, marked by exposure to knowledge that no mortal mind was meant to possess." He turned his attention specifically to Hartwell, who remained suspended in his transformed state between life and death. "And you, my dear scholar, are now bound to me by ties that transcend mortal understanding. You may have rejected my offer of partnership, but the transformation has been completed nonetheless. You will serve my purposes whether you will it or not." With these words, the White Canon began to fade, but his departure was not the dissolution they had witnessed before. Instead, he seemed to withdraw deeper into the manor itself, becoming part of its very structure and foundation. As his form grew less distinct, his voice echoed from every corner of the building. "Greystone Manor is now my seat of power in the material world, and all who dwell within its walls are subject to my influence. The great work will continue, though in ways more subtle than I had originally planned. The barriers between life and death will weaken gradually, and when the time is right, the final transformation will be completed." The silence that followed his withdrawal was profound and somehow final, as if the very universe had exhaled in relief at the cessation of his immediate presence. But the relief was short-lived, for all present understood that what they had witnessed was not victory, but merely a strategic retreat by forces beyond their comprehension. Dr. Ashworth was the first to speak, his voice shaking with exhaustion and barely controlled terror. "He has not been defeated," the old rector said grimly. The binding ritual succeeded only in limiting his immediate power, forcing him to adopt more subtle methods. In some ways, this may be even more dangerous than direct confrontation. Mrs. Blackwood had lapsed into a catatonic state, her mind apparently unable to process the full horror of what she had experienced. Graves maintained his vigil over her, but the elderly butler's weathered features showed the strain of encounters that had pushed him far beyond the limits of normal human endurance. It was Hartwell who posed the most immediate concern, for his transformation had indeed been completed despite his resistance to the White Canon's will. While he retained his human consciousness and apparent free will, his physical form had been permanently altered by exposure to supernatural forces. His eyes continued to burn with otherworldly light. His skin had taken on the waxy pallor of the grave, and when he spoke, his voice carried harmonics that resonated with powers beyond mortal comprehension. "I can feel his influence," Hartwell said, his transformed voice carrying a note of desperate urgency. "Even now, in retreat, he continues to work upon my mind and soul. I am becoming something that is neither fully alive nor properly dead, a bridge between worlds that he can use to further his purposes." The implications of this revelation were staggering. If the White Canon could indeed use Hartwell as an unwilling agent in the material world, then his apparent withdrawal might be part of a larger strategy designed to infiltrate and corrupt the realm of the living from within. Over the following days, as word of the night's events spread through the local community, a pattern of supernatural influence began to emerge that confirmed their worst fears. Strange dreams plagued the village inhabitants, visions of white-robed figures beckoning from the depths of ancient tombs, whispered promises of power over death itself, and images of loved ones rising from their graves to walk among the living once more. Several residents reported encounters with figures that resembled deceased relatives or friends, beings that spoke with familiar voices, but whose eyes held the cold light of the grave. These apparitions were not malevolent in any obvious way, but their presence seemed to weaken the barriers between life and death, making the supernatural seem increasingly natural and acceptable. Dr. Ashworth attempted to rally the ecclesiastical authorities to address this growing threat, but found himself dismissed as an elderly clergyman suffering from nervous exhaustion. The church hierarchy had no framework for understanding or combating the subtle corruption that was spreading through the region, and their attempts at conventional blessing and consecration proved ineffective against forces that operated according to entirely different rules. Mrs. Blackwood never fully recovered from her experiences at the manor. Though she regained her basic faculties after several weeks of care, she remained subject to periods of withdrawal, during which she claimed to hear voices calling to her from beneath the ground. Eventually, she was persuaded to take residence with distant relatives in Scotland, leaving Greystone Manor to whatever fate awaited it. Graves remained at his post with the stubborn loyalty of his class and generation, but the strain of maintaining normalcy in a house that had become a focal point for supernatural activity took a severe toll on his health. He aged visibly in the months following the climactic encounter, and more than once he was found standing in empty rooms, carrying on conversations with people who were not there. It was Hartwell's fate, however, that proved most disturbing. Despite his resistance to the White Canon's influence, the transformation that had been worked upon him continued to progress in subtle but inexorable ways. His need for ordinary food and sleep diminished, replaced by hungers that could only be satisfied by contact with death and decay. He found himself drawn to churchyards and burial grounds, where he would stand for hours among the graves, listening to voices that only he could hear. Most troubling of all was the gradual change in his scholarly interests. Where once he had been drawn to the ordered study of historical documents, he now found himself obsessed with texts that dealt with necromancy and communication with the dead. His research took on an increasingly feverish quality, as if he were searching for some crucial piece of knowledge that remained just beyond his grasp. The Abbey documents themselves had survived the night's supernatural violence, but they were changed in ways that defied rational explanation. New text appeared on the ancient vellum with disturbing regularity, passages that seemed to record contemporary events as if written by observers from beyond the grave. The Chronicle of St. Dunstan continued to grow, adding new entries that described the gradual spread of the White Canon's influence throughout the Norfolk countryside. One particularly disturbing entry, written in a hand that resembled Hartwell's own scholarly script, appeared 6 months after the climactic encounter. The barriers weaken with each passing day, and the work of centuries nears completion. Those who were marked by his touch serve his purposes whether they will it or not, becoming unwitting agents of a design that transcends mortal comprehension. The White Canon's patience is infinite, and his victory inevitable. What was begun in the depths of St. Dunstan's Abbey will find its fulfillment in ways that mortal minds cannot fully grasp. As the first anniversary of the terrible night approached, reports of supernatural activity throughout East Anglia increased dramatically. Ancient burial grounds experienced unexplained disturbances, with graves found open despite the presence of heavy stone slabs. Churches reported problems with their consecrated ground, as if the very earth itself were rejecting the sacred rites that had protected it for generations. Most ominous of all were the accounts of travelers who claimed to have encountered the White Canon himself, walking the Norfolk roads in the hours before dawn. These witnesses, when they could be induced to speak at all, described a figure of terrible majesty, who offered knowledge and power to those bold enough to accept his teachings. Some accepted these offers and disappeared, while others fled and were found days later in states of complete mental collapse. The final entry in this account must be written by another hand, for Dr. Edmund Hartwell was discovered one winter morning in the library of Greystone Manor, seated at the reading table where he had first encountered the Abbey documents over a year before. His transformation was complete. The thing that had once been a distinguished Cambridge scholar was now something else entirely, a being that existed simultaneously in the realms of the living and the dead. He was not deceased in any conventional sense, for his body showed no signs of decay or corruption, but neither was he truly alive, for the spark of humanity that had once animated his form had been replaced by something alien and terrible. When spoken to, he would respond with perfect courtesy and scholarly precision, but his words carried undertones that suggested knowledge of things that no mortal mind should contemplate. The White Cannon's final victory was thus achieved not through dramatic supernatural assault, but through the patient corruption of a single human soul. In Hartwell, he had created the perfect agent for his continued influence in the material world, a being who appeared human, but was in truth something far more dangerous, a bridge between dimensions that could never be fully closed. And so the ancient evil that had slumbered beneath Norfolk soil for centuries found its path back into the world of the living. The Abbey of St. Dunstan was long dissolved, its buildings reduced to romantic ruins that attracted antiquarian tourists on summer afternoons. But beneath the pleasant countryside, in chambers that existed partially outside normal space and time, the White Cannon continued his interrupted work. The barriers between life and death grew thinner with each passing year, and those with the knowledge to perceive such things began to speak in whispers of a time when the grave would hold no dominion, when the ancient dead would walk openly among the living, and when the natural order that had governed existence since the dawn of time would be replaced by something infinitely more terrible, the uneasy atmosphere that had first drawn Dr. Hartwell to investigate the Abbey documents had been only the beginning, a minor disturbance that heralded transformations beyond mortal comprehension. In seeking to understand the past, he had inadvertently helped to shape a future in which the very concepts of life and death would lose all meaning, and humanity would learn to late the true cost of disturbing forces that should have remained forever buried in the darkness beneath the earth.